They said this photo never existed. A moment in history, erased from every record. 6 men, standing against a wall. 5 already lifeless, and 1, still fighting for breath. No trial, no judge, only the sheriff's gun, and the whispers of a midnight execution. The man in the center, he knew something. Something that could bane the whole town to the ground. And in the next few minutes, you'll see the secret they tried to bury forever. Welcome to another untold story from the shadows of history. My name is John. I am the voiceover artist for this channel, and this is Historia Unseen. This is the photograph they swore no one would ever see. 6 men, a wall, and the law itself breaking its own rules. Today, you'll see the truth they tried to bury forever. 5 men already lifeless, 1 still standing, barely breathing. A sheriff who feared the courts and preferred the rope. This is not just about a hanging. It's about a town built on gold, greed, and secrets. And 1 outlaw who carried the key to destroy it all. Stay with me, because the moment you see what was hidden in this picture, you'll never forget it. It began in the summer of 1874. The sun hung heavy over the dry plains, and the wind carried dust from one forgotten town to the next. On the edge of the frontier, far from any capital or courthouse, stood the growing town of Redwater. It was a place where fortunes were made in gold and lost in a single card game. Redwater was no ordinary settlement. It was a town where law existed only in the shape of a man's shadow, and the man casting the biggest shadow was Sheriff Elijah Boone. He was tall, slow-spoken, and feared for reasons no one dared to say aloud. To understand this story, you must understand Redwater itself. It was part of a young nation still trying to find its identity. The Civil War was over, but scars remained deep. Railroads stretched like veins across the land, carrying settlers, dreamers, and the desperate into territories not yet tamed. And in these wild corners, the law often meant the will of whoever held the most power. Boone's power came from 2 places: his badge and his friends among the richest ranchers and mine owners. In their eyes, Boone wasn't just the law. He was the wall that kept chaos from reaching their doorsteps. But to the poor, the drifters, and anyone who stood in his way, Boone was something else entirely. On the morning of June 5th, 6 riders appeared on the horizon. They moved like shadows in the rising heat, hats low, eyes fixed ahead. Some said they were just passing through. Others whispered they had business in town, the kind of business that could get a man killed. The leader, a man named Daniel Cross, was not unknown. Once, he had worn a badge himself in another territory, but he had also made enemies, and it was said he knew things, dangerous things, about powerful men in Redwater, the kind of knowledge that could turn the whole town upside down. The 6 dismounted at the Silver Spur Saloon. Boots hit the date. Dust rose in the air like smoke from a fire. From the boardwalk, townsfolk watched in silence. Every move the strangers made was followed by unseen eyes. Inside the saloon, Cross ordered a drink. He kept his voice low, but his words carried weight. A ranch hand swore later he heard Cross mention the sheriff's name and the word proof. That was enough to set the next events in motion. By nightfall, Boone had gathered his deputies. No warrants were written. No trials were planned. The 6 men were taken from the saloon by force, dragged into the street under the cold light of a half-moon. Chains rattled. Boots scuffed the date. They were marched toward the east end of town, toward the wall. The wall was an ugly thing, tall, gray, and bare, except for the ropes hanging from its top beam. Every soul in Redwater knew what it meant, but few had the courage to look at it for long. One by one, the nooses were slipped over their heads. Cross stood in the middle, his chest rising and falling like a man preparing for a storm. Boone stepped forward, rifle in hand, eyes cold. "You could have walked away," the sheriff said quietly. Cross did not answer, but the faintest smile touched his lips. It was at that moment a sound clicked behind them, the shutter of a camera. A traveling photographer named Samuel Hayes had wandered into town that very day. He had seen the gathering, felt something wrong in the air, and lifted his camera at the exact second Boone gave the signal. The trapdoors fell. 5 bodies jerked, then hung still. Cross was different. The rope caught badly, and he clung to life, gasping. Boone watched, expressionless, before stepping forward. Hayes lowered his camera, heart pounding. He knew the image he had just captured was dangerous. dangerous enough to get him killed. What happened next would set in motion a secret buried for over a century, and that photograph would become the most forbidden image of the Wild West. Samuel Hayes did not sleep that night. He sat in the small room above the general store, the photograph still wet from the chemicals, glowing faintly under the lantern light. He could see every detail, the ropes, the shadows, the cold eyes of Sheriff Boone, and Daniel Cross, still clinging to life. Hayes knew the rules of the frontier. Some secrets were worth killing for, and this picture was worth more than gold to the wrong man. Down on Main Street, the town was silent. Shutters closed tight. Even the saloon, usually alive until dawn, stood dark. Everyone had heard the hangings, and no one wanted to speak of them. Boone, however, was not done. He visited the saloon's back room, where his closest allies, the ranch owners and mine bosses, sat in a haze of cigar smoke. They were not there to drink. They were there to make sure the sheriff's justice remained unquestioned. One of them, a heavy-set man named Cyrus Dent, spoke first. "You handled it fast," he said, voice low. "Too fast," another muttered. "That Cross fellow, he knew things. If he had proof." Boone cut him off. "There's no proof. Not anymore." But his eyes flickered, just for a moment, as if he knew that was a lie. At dawn, Hayes packed his camera and the single, precious photograph. He told the storekeeper he was moving on, heading east. But as he stepped into the street, two of Boone's deputies appeared. Tall, broad, hands resting on their pistols. "Sheriff wants a word," one said. Hayes felt his throat tighten, but he followed, knowing refusal would only bring suspicion. They led him not to Boone's office, but to the stables. Boone stood there, leaning against a post, brushing dust from his coat. "You're a curious man," Boone said slowly. "Curious enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." Hayes kept his face calm. "I just take pictures. Nothing more." Boone's gaze sharpened. Pictures can be dangerous, especially if they show something that never happened. He stepped closer. "If you have one of those, you'll hand it over, or you'll disappear, just like the men last night." Hayes nodded, pretending to agree, but the photograph was already hidden, deep inside his stool bag, beneath the false bottom he had built years ago. That evening, whispers began to stay. Not everyone believed the sheriff's version of events. A schoolteacher claimed she had seen Cross days before, talking with townsfolk about land deeds and missing gold shipments. A stable boy swore he heard one of the other riders say they had letters that could ruin men in power. But in Redwater, whispers were dangerous. One wrong word could put you against the wall. Meanwhile, Hayes rode out of town before sunrise. The sky was still black, the air cold. He didn't stop until the hills swallowed the road behind him. But he carried more than just a photograph. He carried the weight of knowing he had witnessed something no court would ever hear. In the saloon that night, Boone sat alone, sipping whiskey. Outside, the wind pushed dust against the windows, like the town itself was trying to bury the memory. But Boone knew memories had a way of coming back. And if that photograph ever surfaced, it would not just be his badge at stake, it would be his life. 2 days later, a stranger arrived in Redwater. He was quiet, dressed like a prospector, but his questions were too sharp to be harmless. He asked about the hangings, about Cross, and about a photographer. Some said they saw Boone's jaw tighten when the man's name came up. The stranger would not be the last, because somewhere out there, Hayes was keeping the photograph safe, and as long as it existed, the truth still had a chance to be told. Redwater, for now, remained quiet. The wall still stood at the edge of town, ropes swaying in the wind. To most, it was just another warning, a reminder to stay in line. But to a few, it was a grave marker for secrets still breathing, waiting for the right moment to rise. And somewhere, far from the sheriff's reach, Samuel Hayes developed another print of the photo, just in case. Before the hangings, before the photograph, there was the ride into Redwater. It happened on a hot June afternoon, the kind where the sun bakes the land until even the wind feels tired. From the East Road, 6 riders appeared, their shapes shimmering in the heat like ghosts. To the townsfolk, they looked like trouble. And in the Wild West, trouble had a way of finding a place to rest. The man in front rode tall, straight-backed, with a black hat that cast a deep shadow over his eyes. Daniel Cross. Once a lawman, now an outlaw in the eyes of men like Boone. His reputation was strange, feared by some, respected by others. But what set him apart was his mind. He was said to remember every deal, every lie, every man's weakness. Behind him, 5 others followed. Each carried their own story, and their own reasons for being on this road. The second rider, Eli Ward, was a gambler with a quick tongue and a quicker draw. He had left more than one town under the cover of night, usually after winning too much money or saying the wrong thing to the wrong man. Next was Thomas Keene, a former Union soldier. His coat was worn, his eyes older than his years. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. Keene owed Cross his life, a debt he meant to repay. Then came Miguel Ortega, the only one smiling as they rode. Miguel had worked on ranches across the territories and was known for slipping in and out of towns without leaving a trace, except for the trail of broken hearts he left behind. The 5th man, Jack Hollis, was a quiet tracker. He could follow a trail through dust or darkness, and he didn't care whose trail it was. Bean's deputies had once tried to hire him. He refused, and that refusal made him an enemy. The last rider, Samuel Pike, was young, maybe too young, barely 20, but with a gaze that never wavered. He carried an old rifle and a pocket Bible. No one knew which he trusted more. As they rode into Redwater, the sound of hooves drew curious eyes from doorways and windows. The town had seen strangers before, but not like this. There was something in the way they moved, slow, deliberate, as if they knew exactly where they were going and what they would find. Cross led them to the Silver Spur Saloon. It was the kind of place where news traveled fast, and the wrong word could end in a gunfight. Inside, the air smelled of whiskey and sweat. Piano music played in the corner, soft and tired. The 6 ordered drinks, sat at a corner table, and spoke in low voices. What they didn't know, or maybe they did, was that Boone had men in the saloon. Men who listened for anything dangerous, anything that could threaten the sheriff's grip on Redwater. It didn't take long. Eli Ward laughed too loudly at a joke, and in the pause after, the name Boone slipped out. It was followed by words like letters and deeds. Enough to send a cold ripple through the room. At a table near the door, one of Boone's deputies rose quietly and stepped outside. Minutes later, the sheriff himself walked in. The saloon fell silent. Boone didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply walked to the 6 men's table, his boots slow against the floorboards. "Evening, Cross," Boone said, his voice calm but heavy. "It's been a while." Cross looked up, meeting his eyes. Not long enough. The sheriff's gaze slid over the others, weighing them like cattle before a sale. "I hear you've been asking questions. Dangerous questions." Cross leaned back in his chair. "Maybe I just want the truth." Boone smiled, the kind of smile that meant the opposite. "In this town, truth is what I say it is." The tension was thick enough to touch. Boone left without another word, but everyone knew what his silence meant. By nightfall, the 6 men would no longer be strangers in Redwater. They would be enemies. As the sun dipped low, casting the streets in red light, the riders stayed together. They talked about leaving, but something kept them there. Maybe it was Cross's determination. Maybe it was the belief that they could stand up to Boone. Or maybe they underestimated just how far the sheriff would go to protect his power. Because by sunrise, 5 of them would hang from the wall, and 1 would fight to take a breath as the camera clicked. Night fell over Redwater like a slow-moving shadow. The heat of the day slipped away, replaced by a dry, restless wind that rattled the saloon doors and whispered through the empty streets. Inside the Silver Spur, the 6 riders stayed close at their table. The piano player had packed up early. The bartender kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting trouble and dreading it. Daniel Cross noticed it first. The low crunch of boots on the boardwalk outside. Too many boots. The flicker of lamplight catching the shine of a rifle barrel. He didn't need to speak. The others felt it too. The saloon doors swung open. Sheriff Boone stepped in, flanked by 4 deputies. Their faces were blank, their eyes cold. They didn't come for a drink. Boone let the silence stretch, the only sound the wind outside and the faint creak of the floorboards. Finally, he spoke. "Stand up," he said. No explanation, no accusations, just the order. Cross didn't move. Instead, he locked eyes with Boone. "On what charge?" he asked, voice calm but heavy. Boone's lips twitched, not a smile, not quite anger. Charges don't matter. Not tonight. One deputy stepped forward and grabbed Eli Ward by the arm. The gambler twisted, but another deputy's pistol was already at his ribs. Miguel Ortega laughed under his breath, a laugh with no humor. Guess we're not leaving after all. The rest happened fast. The riders were pulled from their seats, their hands bound with rough rope. No one in the saloon said a word. Some turned away. Others stared into their drinks as if the bottom of a glass could hide them from the truth. Out in the street, the air was sharp and cold. A few townsfolk peeked from windows as the 6 men were marched down Main Street. The sound of their boots against the date was the only music, a slow, grim beat. At the edge of town, the wall waited, tall, weathered, and hung with 6 ropes swaying lightly in the wind. The moon cast a pale glow over it all, turning the scene into something from a nightmare. Boone stopped the line in front of the wall. He removed his hat, wiped his brow, and looked at Cross. "You should have kept riding," he said quietly. "You should have stayed out of Redwater." Cross didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried enough for every man, and the few hidden on liquors, to hear. Truth is a way of finding a man, even out here. Boone's jaw tightened. Not if the man disappears first. Ropes were slipped over their heads, one by one. Miguel kept his grin, even as the rough fibers touched his skin. Eli muttered something no one could hear. Keene closed his eyes. Pike's lips moved in silent prayer. Hollis stared straight ahead, unblinking. Cross stood last. The rope itched against his neck, but his eyes never left Boone's. That was when the sound came, the faint click of a camera shutter. It was so small, so soft, that for a moment Boone didn't even notice. But Samuel Hayes, standing near the shadows with his camera, knew what he had captured. The exact moment before history was about to happen. Boone's eyes darted toward him. For a brief second, their gazes locked. Hayes froze, heart pounding, as if the sheriff's stare alone could pull the life from him. Then Boone gave a slight nod to his deputies. The trapdoors fell. 5 bodies dropped and hung still. But Cross, his rope caught, hung sideways, gasping, his boots scraping the wall for any grip. The deputies moved toward him, but Boone raised a hand. He wanted to watch. And in that pause, the camera clicked again. For Hayes, time seemed to slow. He knew he had just recorded something dangerous, something that could cost him his life if Boone decided to act. But he also knew some truths were worth the risk. In that single moment, Redwater's quiet streets became the stage for a story that would outlive them all. And Hayes, whether he liked it or not, had just become part of it. The ropes creaked in the wind. 5 bodies hung still, shadows swaying against the wooden wall. The air smelled of dust, rope fibers, and the faint tang of blood where rough hemp had torn skin. But Daniel Cross, he was still alive. The noose had twisted when the trapdoor fell. Instead of snapping his neck clean, it had tightened across his jaw, crushing his windpipe but leaving him breathing, barely. His boots scraped against the wall, searching for any kind of grip. Gasps and whispers came from the shadows where a few townsfolk watched in secret. Some clutched their hands to their mouths. Others just stared, frozen, as if they couldn't look away. Boone didn't move. He stood at the center, arms folded, eyes locked on Cross. It wasn't mercy that kept him from ending it. It was curiosity. Cross's face turned red, veins standing out against his skin. He clawed at the rope with bound hands, the fibers cutting into his wrists. His chest heaved, each breath a ragged scrape. But his eyes, those sharp, defiant eyes, never left the sheriff's. Miguel's body hung beside him, still smiling in death. Keene swayed slowly, his head bowed. The rest were gone, their lives taken in silence. Hayes stood in the shadows, his camera heavy in his hands. He knew this was the moment, the picture that would show not just death, but the fight against it. The click of the shutter cut through the night like a shot. Boone heard it. He turned his head slowly toward Hayes. The 2 men locked eyes again. For a heartbeat, Hayes thought Boone might walk over, rip the camera from his hands, and smash it into the date. But the sheriff just stared. Then, almost casually, he looked back at Cross. The minutes dragged like hours. Cross's strength began to fade. His legs slowed, his shoulders sagged, his breaths grew shorter. Yet, somehow, he kept pushing against the wall. Cut him down, one deputy muttered. Boone didn't answer. Sheriff. Boone's voice was calm, almost bored. Not yet. Hayes felt his stomach turn. This wasn't justice. This wasn't even punishment. This was a game, and Boone was the only one allowed to set the rules. Cross's boot slipped one last time. His body jerked, then went still. For a moment, it seemed the fight was over. But then, his chest rose again. The sheriff stepped forward at last. Not to save him, but to end it. Boone drew his pistol, the metal catching the moonlight. He aimed it at Cross's head. A sharp metallic click. The hammer pulled back. Hayes held his breath. And then, something unexpected happened. A sound, faint but clear, came from Cross. A laugh. Rough, broken, but unmistakable. You can't hang the truth, he rasped. Boone froze. For the first time that night, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not fear, but recognition. He lowered the gun, turned to his deputies, cut him down. The rope was slashed, and Cross collapsed to the date, coughing, gasping, but still alive. Two deputies grabbed him under the arms, dragging him away from the wall. Boone didn't watch him go. Instead, he looked back at the hanging wall, the 5 bodies still swaying. He knew letting Cross live wasn't mercy. It was strategy. A dead man's words could be forgotten. A living man's could be silenced. Hayes slipped away into the darkness, heart hammering. He had the photographs, both of them, and now he had something else. A story far more dangerous than he'd realized. Because if Cross had survived, then somewhere out there, the truth still breathed. Samuel Hayes left the hanging wall long before dawn. He didn't ride fast at first. Speed could draw eyes. Instead, he kept a steady pace, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes, listening for the sound of hooves behind him. The 2 photographs were hidden deep inside his full bag. One showed 6 men alive, moments before the trapdoors fell. The other showed Daniel Cross hanging but fighting, boots scraping the wall, eyes burning. Both were proof. Proof Boone could never allow to exist. By the time the sun touched the horizon, Hayes was miles from Redwater. He stopped by a dry creek bed to water his horse, his hand shaking as he pulled out the camera. The glass plates were intact. Every detail of the night was there. The ropes, the shadows, Boone's cold expression. He thought of heading straight east to the nearest railroad town. From there, he could send the photographs to a newspaper in Chicago or St. Louis. Once the images were printed, Boone's control would be gone. But Hayes knew the sheriff. Boone wouldn't sit in his office and wait for trouble to find him. He would send men, fast riders, killers if needed, and they would hunt until they found Hayes. Back in Redwater, Boone stood in his office, staring out the window. The town was quiet again, as if the hangings had never happened. But Boone's mind wasn't on the town. It was on Hayes. One deputy knocked and stepped inside. We tracked him to the creek trail, Sheriff. We can catch him by nightfall. Boone nodded slowly. Bring him back, and bring the camera. If he resists, don't waste a bullet. The deputy understood. In Boone's world, a man who disappeared into the desert left no questions behind. Hayes rode hard through the next stretch of land, open plains with no cover. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth until it shimmered. He knew the deputies would ride faster than him. They had fresher horses, and no fear of being seen. At midday, he spotted an old line shack, a small, half-rotted building once used by cattlemen. It wasn't much, but it offered shade, and maybe, if luck was kind, a place to hide the photographs. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and dry wood. Hayes pulled up a loose floorboard and slid the glass plates underneath, wrapping them in cloth. If Boone's men caught him, at least the proof might survive. Hours later, the sound of hooves echoed across the plains. Hayes crouched low, peering through a crack in the wall. 3 riders appeared, moving in a slow arc, scanning the land like wolves hunting a scent. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, reined his horse toward the shack. Hayes reached for the revolver at his hip, but his hand shook. He wasn't a gunfighter. He was a man with a camera. The rider stopped at the doorway, peering inside. For a long moment, their eyes met. Then, without a word, the man turned his horse and rode back to the others. Hayes didn't know if it was mercy or a trap. By nightfall, Hayes was back in the saddle, heading north toward the railroad. But Boone's men weren't far. He could feel them behind him, like a shadow that never faded. Somewhere in the darkness, a campfire flickered, not his, but theirs. They were close enough to follow him without losing sight, but far enough to strike when the land gave them an advantage. In Redwater, Daniel Cross lay in a cot inside the jail. His neck burned from the rope, and every breath hurt. Boone had left him alive, but under lock and key. The sheriff's deputies guarded the door, keeping him from speaking to anyone. But Cross wasn't done. He knew Hayes had the photographs, and he knew Boone would stop at nothing to get them. Somehow, Cross had to find a way to warn him before it was too late. Out on the open plain, Hayes felt the cold settle in as the wind picked up. He pulled his coat tight and kept riding. Every hoofbeat echoed like a countdown. He didn't know how far Boone's reach went, but he knew one thing for certain. If he didn't reach the railroad by sunrise, he might never leave this land alive. Years passed. The town of Redwater changed like all towns do. The mines ran dry. The saloon closed its doors. The wall at the edge of town stood weathered and splintered, its ropes long gone. Sheriff Elijah Boone's name was still remembered, but not in songs and not with pride. His badge ended up in a dusty case in the old courthouse, a relic no one cared to polish. Daniel Cross was never seen in Redwater again. Some claimed he died on the trail a few years later. Others swore he lived under another name, somewhere far from the reach of men like Boone. And Samuel Hayes. Well, his name faded too. But the photograph did not. It happened in the summer of 1912. In a small farmhouse in Kansas, a man cleaning out his late grandfather's trunk found a stack of old, wrapped glass plates. The cloth was stiff with age, the knots tied carefully. When he unwrapped the first plate, he froze. There, clear as the day it was taken, was the image of 6 men against the wall, 5 with ropes around their necks, 1 still alive, still fighting, eyes locked on something just out of the frame. The man turned the plate over, finding a faint signature etched into the corner. Samuel Hayes. The photograph made its way to a local historian, who recognized the name and the date scratched faintly on the edge. It matched a night in Redwater's records, a night the courthouse listed simply as justice served. No trials, no charges, just 6 names crossed out. When the image was developed, word spread quickly. Historians argued, some saying it was staged, others calling it the most important outlaw-era evidence ever found. But one thing was certain, the sheriff's story, the one that had stood for decades, was now in question. In the photo, Boone stands off to the side, hat low, hand resting on his rifle. The deputies flank the wall. And Cross looks almost alive in the frozen image, a man caught between death and survival. The second plate, the one Hayes took after the trapdoors fell, told the rest of the story. It showed Cross struggling, the rope twisted, his boots scraping the wood. It showed that something had gone wrong. And it showed Boone, watching. The photographs were displayed in a small museum for a time, under glass, with a card reading, "The Redwater Hangings, 1874. Visitors stared in silence. Some leaned closer, trying to see what Cross saw that night. Others focused on Boone, searching his face for guilt or pride. But the real power of the image wasn't just in what it showed. It was in what it made people imagine. Somewhere in the crowd, an older man with a deep scar along his jaw stood quietly. He didn't read the card. He didn't linger. He simply looked at the photograph, nodded once, and walked away. No one noticed the way his hand brushed the edge of his coat, where an old badge might have once been. By the time the photographs reached larger newspapers, Boone was long gone from this world. But his legacy, and Redwater's, had been changed forever. The town could no longer hide behind the words justice served. Because the truth, once seen, can never be erased. And thanks to Samuel Hayes, the night they tried to bury forever would live on for all to see.